Hello and welcome to the Insight Treatment Hour at 98.1 FM and 1220 AM KHTS. Thank you so much for spending some of your afternoon with us today. This is Dr. Trevor Small. I'm the Director of Clinical Development at Insight Treatment Centers, and I am quite honored today to have Gina Tabrizy, who is a fantastic marriage and family therapist and owner of Harmony Heals here in Southern California as a guest today. Gina, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, well, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor for me to be here. And
it is such an interesting time to be a mental health clinician, as I'm sure you can definitely agree, given the current conditions not only of Southern California but of the world, and what a dynamic time to be a clinician. And I just wanted to, and I was hoping just today to talk about a variety of topics, but something that I find to be so much on people's minds when they're calling or coming into our office or coming into Insight Treatment Centers is this idea of what happens next, right? As this pandemic starts to shift and change in the qualities and dimensions that it's been so present for us in the past year. Really, this idea of how do we come out of this pandemic? How do our kids come out of this pandemic stronger? How do they do it? What are some of your thoughts on that?
Well, I think part of it is for people that don't understand or aren't in the field of mental health or have never experienced a traumatic or tragic event throughout their life, that this is a trauma. This is, a history of trauma that we will all experience together, much like we have seen in the past during the Depression or different wars as they occurred, acts of terrorism. This series of events of isolation, being separated from loved ones, and the mass loss of life that has occurred is much akin to being in a war time zone. And so we get very familiar with status quo and doing what we need to do day in and day out just to get by. And so a lot of our emotional life goes unnoticed, undetected, and uncared for. And I think a lot of people lose the pulse and the ability to regulate themselves, to have self-care, and to really manage what's going on emotionally. And some people are not even recognizing what they're experiencing is a response that clinicians know very well, which is post-traumatic stress disorder, as we begin to unfold and get back into the world.
Yeah. I was reading in the Los Angeles Times today in the calendar section. In the California section, there was a wonderful article about mental health and how we as both parents, adults, but also how our kids are adjusting to how it's going to look when we start to come out into the world and we have to deal with so much of the trauma and fear that we've had to live in. I think it's such a wonderful analogy, this idea of really this catastrophic event that has happened in our country and in our world, and how we're dealing with it. Right. You've been a clinician, got to be 30 years, right? I mean, you've worked in lots of places.
Getting in for 35 this year.
Oh, my goodness, and I would love to hear a little bit about some of the work that you do, kind of some of the experience that you've had in the field.
Well, I wanted to, just say in reference to the whole idea of us coming out of this and the particular humans that it's impacting that we might not have thought about, but the humans that are being most gravely affected by this are our adolescents and our young adults in the range of teens to 25. And that's the greatest number increase that I've seen even in my own practice and in the surrounding treatment centers that we serve, because we imagined that they had this resource because they grew up with technology. And so everybody thought, they're going to do great being, stuck at home and being on laptops and computers and phones. and myself and my older generation that we would suffer more because this is very unfamiliar territory for us, but it's quite the opposite. Those of us with maturity and time have a lot of emotional resource that we can use to kind of function in this dysfunctional time. But the younger children haven't developed that yet. They haven't fully developed coping skills, and their peer group is a lifeline for them. And although people are saying, oh, you can connect online and this and that, it is absolutely, they are not having the same experience connecting with their peers through technology that they are in person. And I just want to say to those parents who are saying, my kid's never been depressed or anxious, and now my kid doesn't want to leave their room or is having thoughts of suicide, I want to say to you, you're not alone, and that it's okay. No, it's not okay to, that your child is in danger, but it's okay to know that your child is not coping well with this, and certainly not to assume that you can just talk them into being okay. Part of the work here is to learn a different language that we haven't learned in our society, which we are a society that medicates everything. So we minimize and we medicate. We're like the M&M. That's our double whammy. And so what we need to do is learn to dialogue. Instead of that is to dialogue and to dissect. Allow your children to have the experience of emotion, even if you're intolerant of it, even if it's unfamiliar to you. Let them have their room to fall apart and to cry and to be afraid, and really to voice those things, because if they're talking to you, you're doing good. It's when they stop talking that you're going to find that you have a deeper wound that's going to be much more difficult to treat. And so we've entered into this new paradigm where this generation of parents got used to parenting their kids by technology. The babysitter was the television, the cell phone, and the iPad, and now you're the babysitter and the parent. You're being asked to step forward and to step up, and I would challenge parents to step into that role again, much like it used to be back in the day pre-technology, where parents had to be much more hands-on and available to their children. And so I don't know what you think about that, but that's something that I wanted to offer for parents to know that, yes, you have to be there now. Yes, you have to handhold more than you ever did. And even if you thought your child didn't have any issues pre-COVID and they were this great, beautiful kid, getting good grades and all that stuff, and all of a sudden they can't function, just know that it's okay and that it's normal. That's their response to trauma right now. We need to love them through that, not judge it, not question it, and not criticize it.
Yeah, I think you bring up a lot of really, really interesting points. And I think that the way that teens, what we've asked of teens, at Insight we talk about this idea of community all the time, that it is so essential that our kids and our parents have a community to be present for. And because of this pandemic, I think regrettably we, as a society, from a public health perspective, had to say to our families, had to say to our schools and our workplaces, listen, we need for you to rethink this idea of community, and we need to come back into and survive as nuclear families. And for many families, that involved having kids that had not lived at home for long periods of time come back into the home. And so, for example, in my own world, I have two fantastic, amazing sons, and one of them who goes to USC, and so he moved back home for a period of time. My other son, who goes to boarding school, was back home with us, and we had both this opportunity to experience what it was like to be all together again, but also to see how all of us had changed because of our developmental changes, just because of age and factors, that we'd want to see. But you also bring up this really interesting point about how families talk to one another. And of course, at Insight, and I'm sure in your practice, what we do is we stress this idea of communication and this idea of meeting our kids where our kids are. And it can be so hard, for us adults, because we're in a situation we've never been in, to ask our kids to learn how to relax and to learn how to deal with this anxiety and to know that everything is going to be okay.
Yeah.
And do you remember? I can't remember who that great news used to be a wonderful in Los Angeles, a great news duo, and it was Eggbach, right? Everything's going to be okay. I wish I could remember who those were. I don't know, years ago. But so when you're working,
acronym, though. We need to borrow that.
Yeah. One. I think it's not mine. I wish I could remember. I maybe during the break I'll look it up who it was.
Yeah.
But this idea though. So let's talk about. So as we've put our families into this pressure cooker and we're asking them to come out, what do you imagine some of the things that families are going to be dealing with? What are some of the things you imagine they're going to be dealing with when they come out of pandemic and go back into schools, go back into their worlds?
Well, I think the children are still going to be having that PTSD response, so a little hypersensitive, hyper alert, acute, responses to their environment, being afraid of contact with other peers and other people. Also just being outside. Like a lot of kids, even though we've been encouraging them to go outside, have not been doing so, actually. A lot of them have gotten comfortable in their little cocoons at home. So what you might see is a hesitancy and a fear and a resistance for your kid, even though you're encouraging them to get out, especially, a lot of you that have already vaccinated, that the vaccination, at least for me, gave me a little sense of more freedom and also a little bit feeling like I had a protection. I had like an additional support. And I think, that's another thing that's going to be in question for people, whether they make that choice or not. But wearing the mask, socially distancing, keeping yourself safe in that way. But your kids are going to be scared and they're going to have those fears. They're going to be anxious. You might see them, kind of retreat. You might see them go out and then, have episodes where they get scared while they're in a social situation, even at the grocery store or whatever, where they might want to leave early, where they might want to cut out, or if they're an event, even at a family event, you might notice them start to withdraw or get a little bit anxious and nervous, maybe even asking you to leave early. I would tell everybody to just be sensitive to how they're feeling and do the process slowly. If you can, just slowly reintegrating them into some normal things. Take them out to your local grocery store and go with them, or if it's their first time, maybe going back to school on campus, you might want to take them. If your kid especially has already been experiencing some of these high intensity emotions, tearful outbursts, maybe angry or irritable, maybe sullen and quiet and, solitary and withdrawing, to kind of notice those more extreme emotions and to pay attention to it. There's a beautiful technique that I'm sure you're familiar with, is emotional freedom technique, EFT. That's also known as tapping. And I encourage anybody listening to just go on YouTube and put in tapping. I have a video on it as well, but, under my name, but anybody that does it. It's a wonderful tool to teach kids to self-soothe and regulate. It's kind of like if you think about when you were little, you needed that transitional object when mommy was first going to leave you at school and you needed your bunny or your blanket or your little race car or whatever your little object was that helped you anchor the safety of home. Our kids need a little bit of that. And one of the ways is to teach them mindful meditation and breathing, slowly inhaling, counting to 10, releasing their breath, and also the tapping. And the tapping technique taps on the meridians. I believe there's 8 or 9 meridian points on the body, and it teaches you that in these areas where we have a little bit more of an electrical charge that runs through the body, that by tapping it, you kind of help the nervous system to slow down a bit. And I found it really helpful during the pandemic myself, and it became habitual. And I taught all my clients and all the people I work at the treatment centers that I work at, all of the women there. We use the tapping, and it's just tapping, taking deep breaths, and saying affirmations that are kind and loving to oneself. We forget that how we talk to ourselves has a lot to do with how we respond and react in the world,
Right.
Very important.
Absolutely. And I'm so happy that you've brought up some of the somatic work that you do, because I think that the listeners today would be really, really interested in hearing about techniques that they might be able to use at home, that they might be able to use with their kids, they might be able to use with perhaps their parents that are living there that haven't had the opportunity to learn about somatic therapies and the work that you might do in that area. And so for example, we talk about tapping, we talk about calming down the nervous system, right?
Yeah.
And you mentioned also mindfulness. I think I heard mindfulness in there, and mindful meditation. And do you have recommendations for maybe meditations that are good, or YouTube things that are good that people can find?
Yeah, so I love, just about any form of meditation that there is, and I think it's Deepak Chopra might have said this, and I'm not sure, and I'm borrowing it, is even one breath, and it might have been Eckhart Tolle, to quote two gentlemen that can give you a lot on YouTube around mindfulness, Eckhart Tolle and Deepak Chopra, and they say one breath is meditation. So being able to just inhale very deeply and slowly, and then exhaling, paying attention in that very moment, in that very second, to only your breath is what we call mindfulness. People often wonder, what's the context of it, and is it some woo-woo, like metaphysical thing, or
Sure.
it's just basically breathing and concentration and relaxation because of, obviously the response to the body when you take in oxygen like that. It helps you to just slow everything down. And so there's all kinds of YouTube videos on mindfulness. There's with music, without music, with words, with chants. There's guided meditations, which I love. So whatever,
Gina,
as long as you do that.
Well, let's do this. Let's have our audience take one real nice, long, deep breath here during our break. Of course, we're on 98.1 FM and 1220 AM KHTS hometown station. And we'll be right back after a few of these commercial breaks.
KHTS strives to give the Santa Clarita Valley all the information they need. And when our computers aren't working the way they should, we call Resurgence, your true source for IT. Resurgence provides outstanding customer service while also providing the highest technical ability. They strive to do what's best to improve and protect your business. For more information on Resurgence, call 349-4114 or visit resurgenceit.com.
Have you heard that you can attend college tuition-free for your first 2 years?
The Canyons Promise program at College of the Canyons can make that happen.
First-time, full-time students in fall 2021 are encouraged to sign up now for Canyons Promise.
Benefits include paid enrollment fees, access to program counselors, priority registration, and more.
Attend COC tuition-free.
Visit canyons.edu/promise now for information and important deadlines.
canyons.edu/promise.
KHTS, your hometown station.
Well, hopefully that was a very peaceful meditation there for all of you. We're back at 98.1 FM, 1220 AM KHTS. This is Dr. Trevor Small with you on your hometown station KHTS with our guest Gina Tabrizy during the Insight Treatment Hour. And thank you so much for spending some of your afternoon with us today. And Gina and I were just talking a little bit about some of the somatic interventions that we are finding to be very helpful with our kids. And I had to jump in there with Gina so we could just take a moment of break there. And I stopped her while we were talking about meditations.
Yeah.
And what I was hoping also, Gina, we could talk a little bit about was some other somatic techniques that parents might be able to use with their kids to help them to relax, because I think you bring up this great point that we haven't been. So, for example, for many kids, they have not been in a restaurant for a year.
Right.
Many people have not been on a plane for a year. And as more and more people become vaccinated, we're going to be asking ourselves, but especially our kids, to start to trust that the environment is safe again. So what are some things that parents might be able to do to help to teach their kids to relax before they get into those anxiety-provoking situations?
So there's a lot of things that I like to do. And when we went into the break, we were talking about emotional freedom technique and tapping, which you can look up on YouTube. And I encourage anyone listening to do that because it's something available to you. You can do this yourself. You don't need a therapist to guide you through that. And the other thing that we don't often lean into, but utilizing all the senses, you know, your smell, your taste, your touch, your sound are all ways to get into a meditative state or to use mindfulness to keep you in the present moment. One of the ways that we create anxiety is about thinking ahead and getting too far ahead of ourselves, and it creates a sense of worry. And when we worry about things, we activate the nervous system to get into what we call the fight, flight, or freeze response. It's like telling your brain, there is a problem, we're in danger, and I need to run. And you don't always need to run away from a situation. So your kids are feeling this as they're leaving the house and you're getting ready to go on a trip. I just went on vacation 2 weeks ago, and it's the first time I've flown in a year. And one of the other things that I brought with me besides the tapping was I have essential oils that I carry with me. And so if you've ever wondered, there's a lot of advertising around this, and, you know, there's different companies you can use. I happen to use doTERRA. I don't represent them. That's the line that I was introduced to that has really worked for me. And I use a diffuser in the office when I'm doing therapy with my clients. There's certain familiar smells. If you think about home and you think about Christmas and you think about Thanksgiving and you think of those scents, they evoke in you these memories that are very precious, and hopefully, unless you're like, there's some serious dysfunctionalness in your family, which there is for a lot of us, so it might not be a happy memory, but think of one that's happy for you, and it evokes that response. So having essential oils, it helps you ground in this sense of peace and calmness. There's a lot of different studies that have been done about not only essential oils, but how mindfulness actually activates GABA in the brain. It helps that happy, feel-good feeling and response. So that's something I do. And then an object, really holding on to an object, maybe for a young child, it's a stuffed animal. Maybe for a teenager, it's like a photo of friends. It could be on their phone. It could be something from their room that they've had from childhood. It could be a certain shirt, like their favorite shirt, or part of their clothing from home, a jacket or maybe a blanket. Anything that anchors them with a sense, maybe their slippers, they like those UGG slippers and those fuzzy slippers, and that makes them feel safe. Let them have something that reminds them of the familiarity of home and their room and their space, and to bring that with them on the journey is one way to do that, you know. And something that really happened, and I know you're aware of it, Dr. Small, during the pandemic, is everybody gained 20 plus pounds, but they also gained a dog or a pet. So a lot of people found emotional, you know, the support animals, that's been a trend in the last probably 10 years now, is really came to the forefront as a way for people to really self-soothe. And some people may have an animal that can easily travel with them. And if you've never considered it before, this might be the time to consider doing that.
Yes, the wonderful support animal. I think fondly of Alfie, my rescue Multi-Poo, who is currently at home. I'm sure ripping into one of my shoes. But I mean, the idea, though, that we all have sought out comfort. And we sought out comfort because I think when the world feels to be unstable, what we do is we fall back on things that can help us feel more stable, such as eating or drinking or using drugs. Yeah. And I think this is a really interesting segue because I think as mental health professionals, all of us have been anticipating the rise of people entering into treatment post-pandemic because of turning to substances to soothe or relapsing on substances because of a need to return back to a maladaptive coping skill, right?
Right. Yes.
And go ahead, please.
It's a pandemic in and of itself. So, prior to the pandemic, we were having an opiate epidemic. And that did not go underground during COVID. If anything, it escalated. And all the percentages, whether it's been drug or overdose, using alcohol abuse, substance abuse, eating disorders, everything increased. There wasn't an area in our world in mental health, severe psychosis. You saw an influx of hospitalization for emergency hospitalization for people having psychotic breaks, and much more prevalence in all areas. And it affected everybody equally. So it's all races, colors, creeds, genders, socioeconomic status was an equal problem. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, the hardest hit are our young adults and adolescents, where we have waiting lists now up to several months for treatment for teens and children who are needing to be hospitalized for a depression that has become so severe. We now have the chronic suicidality, suicidal thoughts and plans of suicide, along with the severe depression while they've been isolating at home. So people have been maladaptively coping to the extreme. You know, alcohol can be, and marijuana, and probably all illicit substances can be delivered to your home now. And so that only increased the access for people who might have been hiding it before, or maybe had to think about planning how they were going to get their use. Now, any time of day or night could order in delivery and didn't even have to leave home. So, you know, they're drinking themselves to death, literally. And we've had so many people come to treatment who had to leave their house because they said, I will not and cannot stay sober in my own home. I can't do it, you know, just drinking and drinking for months on end, you know. So it's frightening when you think about it, actually.
Yeah, you know, and in fact, at Insight, where a lot of programs, of course, during the pandemic, needed to go remote because of the whatever reasons their staff or their higher ups felt. Insight remained open throughout the pandemic, and we remain open. And in fact, we had added an additional 2 facilities, one in Modesto and one in Santa Clarita, because the need was so great for mental health services, and so many teens and families really needed the support because of feeling so cut off. And so part of the struggle, I think, for as people come out of this pandemic and as families reunite with other families, is understanding that a lot of kids might have returned back to some maladaptive ways of interacting because they felt so isolated, and that there is hope. There are treatment options. There are ways for families to get the support that they need. But the most important thing, we go back to something that you mentioned very early on in our program, which is so important, is the abilities for families to talk to each other. And for some families, there's an expectation that if everything is quiet, everything is okay.
No.
And I would argue, I'd argue the opposite. I think that when our kids get quiet, I think that's when you got to be a little bit concerned.
Something really scary is going on. Yeah.
Yes.
You want to see your adolescent, you know, getting in your face and arguing over what's for dinner or what you're putting on the television or what stupid outfit you have on today and how you're going to embarrass them. And when they're not doing that and they're going inward and they're becoming more silent, that's a red flag. You know, we had a call probably a month ago of a young child. She was 11 years old, and the parents called us because she disclosed that she was suicidal, and she had a plan. She had a very clear plan of action. And as parents, that's your worst nightmare, to hear that your child is suffering to the point of feeling that there's no purpose and no reason for them to continue their life. And so this is not something that you don't think of this as a phase. When children speak, and have suicidal thoughts, sometimes we like to think, they're just going through a phase, or they're being dramatic. They're being too sensitive as a young person because of all the hormonal changes that they go through developmentally. What I want people to understand that they often don't, and is, it's a frustration. Having been a parent, I'm a parent of 2 that are in their 20s now, and having, been a clinician that's walked a lot of people through this, is they don't think like you. I don't care how intelligent your child is. They don't have the capacity. They have not fully developed all the parts of their brain and their prefrontal, especially lobe. Their higher functioning and reasoning is not fully online. So they are raw impulse and emotion. So impulse and emotion is a deadly combination in a child who's either starting to use substances to cope and or is so depressed and so withdrawn that the possibility of suicide as an alluring thought is very, very real. And so please don't ever dismiss those kinds of comments and allow your child to think that you're okay with it and that they're just being dramatic. You always need to check that out with a professional. You always need to take them in just like you would if they broke a toe or they got a cut or they had a fever. You wouldn't even question taking them to a doctor for a visit to do a checkup.
Right. Absolutely. And when we think about a couple of things that were taken away as parents that allowed us to communicate with our kids, and I'm thinking specifically one of them, sports. So how often, if you think about that there's this opportunity at least once or twice a week where a couple members of the family might sit down and watch an athletic event on television. And during the breaks of that athletic event, there's a conversation that goes on. There's a connection. There's an opportunity to check in with one another. Hey, how are things going with that math assignment? Or are you still dating that girl that you were interested in? It becomes a very casual conversation. The other thing that I think that we lost during this pandemic that's slowly coming back around, but I think it was definitely something that we missed, were car rides with our kids. Driving our kids to and from school, because when you imagine talking with a teenager or I'd say a teenager, maybe 10 and up, one of the things that can be difficult is sitting face to face and having a conversation about something that's difficult for them. But a car provides us with the opportunity to be together, but to not have to look at one another, right? Right. And so in not looking at one another, the teenager is able to say, hey, Mom, hey, Dad, I'm sort of struggling with this, or I'm angry at this teacher, or this happened. And they don't have to be concerned about the glare that might come over because the parent probably isn't going to want to take their eyes off the road for too long, right? Sure. Without that, conversations become much more intense. And at home, one of the things that we encourage here at Insight is families learning how to talk to one another, not just about the things that aren't going right, but about things that really are just commonplace. So things like what kind of dinner are they anticipating, or how are their friends doing in this place or that place, because we're learning how to talk to one another. And if anything that the pandemic provided for families was this opportunity to be in a very condensed environment and learn how to talk to each other, right?
Well, and there's two things that, are really important to note about that is the families that had the opportunity and took the opportunity as a learning and as a growing experience to reconnect, whether that was using board games or now your kids who used to go in their room, do whatever, would come out because you became their socialization. You became their outlet to the world. So your kids, I know it happened with my kid, came closer to us because we became the outlet for social contact for them. So then now we're doing things together and watching things together and planning our meals together much more than pre-COVID, because each one of us has our own jobs and our own pursuits, and we're going in our own directions, even though we were all under the same roof. But something else happened. Families that were disturbed and dysfunctional escalated. So you now had kids in the same home with two parents that were already at the breaking point, whether that was due to addictions, whether that was violence in the home or domestic violence, or whether they were on the brink of a divorce because of irreconcilable differences. The kids were now in the middle of what maybe sometimes they had covered up or had gone somewhat unnoticed. The kids had the outlet of going to school. They had the outlet of sports and after-school activities, and now they're home with it and in it. And so, of course, a lot of these kids became more ill, and their behaviors are escalating because they're just mirroring what's going on in the home. And these parents are rushing to get their kids to treatment. However, the fruit didn't fall far from the tree. Oftentimes, the parents are bringing the kids in and neglecting their own mental health and not paying attention to the ways in which they have impacted this child. So it's a family systems problem. You know, when you look at addiction and you look at violence in the home, it becomes a family systems, not just, you know, we're going to point a finger at any one person of the family. We're all in it now, and we're all suffering because of it. We had so many adults come in that were brought in by their adult children because of addictive behavior, where they hadn't noticed it to the level that it was impairing their parent because they had so many outlets. And then all of a sudden, being in the home with the parent, they recognized that their parent was not functioning and had an abusive relationship with alcohol, you know, I'll call it. So that was an interesting turn of events.
Right. And I think that it can be really difficult for adult children to try to get an assessment or gauge the use patterns of their parents, because they might have a different view of alcohol use than their parents, or it may be hard for them to imagine that their parents might turn to alcohol as a soothing technique.
Right. We also had teens whose parents were using with them. We had teens whose parents were saying, you need to go get help, but then the teen is struggling. I can't return to the same house that I'm using with my parent, but my parent is telling me to go get sober. So we had this displacement of where do you send that teen? And so there's a lot of dynamics that, you know, it's not making the news, it's not making the front page, but it should be, because all of these things ultimately are going to affect this generation. And moving forward, these are going to be the adults, you know, that are going to be in charge and that are leading the way in terms of what mental health might look like. And we all know it changed dramatically. One positive thing, another positive thing I should say that came out of it was the movement towards telehealth, or easy access to clinical care, because a lot of kids will want to refuse as much as the adults who are still impaired and not wanting to face and take personal responsibility. They don't want to go into the office. They don't want to be seen by other people. They're afraid of being judged. And somehow this gave a little bit of a veil to that, where they're like, well, I can talk to them on the phone. I don't have to really, you know, I don't have to really see them in person. It gave them a little bit of a cushion so that it made it easier for people who might not seek treatment to come in.
Right. Absolutely. As we're warming up here for our next break, what I'm hoping that we can talk about, Gina, sort of near the end of our time together, is this idea about collaborative care, about the integration of lots of members of a team to help families, to help teens, to circle the wagons a little bit as we recreate our tribes and return back into society out of this pandemic. And so please bear with us here for just a few more moments of break here at 98.1 FM KHTS and 1220 AM, your hometown station. We'll be back in just a moment.
The Oasis treatment at the Ivy Day Spa begins with a gentle exfoliation, then rinsed away in warm showers. You're painted with a soothing aloe vera, shea butter, and coconut oil body mask. Then travel through the warm Hydro Cave chambers. The relaxation chamber completes your Oasis body moisturizing treatment with a pH balancing mist and a warm cup of tea. Feel refreshed, hydrated, and relaxed. Pamper yourself. The Ivy Day Spa, Town Center Drive.
Moms, dads, this is Cardin Ellis, owner of Unipest. If your house has ants, spiders, or gophers, or you want a free orange oil termite inspection, you have to call Unipest Termite and Pest Control, Santa Clarita's only factory-certified orange oil pest control company. We specialize in organic, low-impact, and traditional pest control options that are all kid-friendly, pet-friendly, and affordable with no contracts, and we're SCV-owned and operated. Call us at 661-BUG-7575 or visit unipest.com.
Hey there, it's Tori with your hometown station weather. Gorgeous day today and warm with highs in the upper 80s, overnight lows in the 50s. For anything and everything Santa Clarita Valley related, go to hometownstation.com.
98.1 FM and AM 1220.
Trevor Small with Insight Treatment Centers, and I'm the Director of Clinical Development here at Insight Treatment, and we've been talking for the past hour with Gina Tabrizy, and we have had this wonderful opportunity to learn about Gina, to hear about her practice, which is, of course, called Harmony Heals, and is located here in Southern California. And I wonder, Gina, just a little bit about the way that you work, maybe the type of people that you see. Could you tell us a little bit about the practice?
Well, we're very blessed in that my early beginnings was in psychiatric care in residential treatment hospital settings. And so I was exposed to working with children, pre-adolescents, adolescents, and adults. So I ran the gamut of developmental, the lifespan. And so we are able to serve any age range at our treatment center and outpatient center. And the other thing that happened for me was very early on, I was entrenched in the work of dealing with trauma and severe trauma and trauma survivors. And what I came to believe and to know for myself is that rooted in trauma, there is always going to be these coping mechanisms that come out of trauma. And almost everyone that experiences some form of addiction has had some severe trauma throughout their lifespan, and that could be as simple as being abandoned or ignored or, looked down at, not talked to in a loving manner, to abuse, neglect, sexual, emotional, and physical. So it runs a gamut of things, but I consider trauma to be what Pia Mellody used to say was anything less than nurturing. And it's, to me, whenever your emotional needs are not met and go unmet, that the child experiences this void that we call trauma. And at the roots of all trauma, it branches out these symptoms and these ways and maladaptive behaviors that we create that later become disorders and diagnoses that we in the mental health profession like to label and name and deem. But the bottom line is that it's important to uncover and discover the roots of where we came from, and understanding those roots, that we can learn what maladaptive behaviors we did adapt and use throughout our lives to cope, and then we can unlearn these things. And through that process is a process of grieving that happens. And I've known for me, I come from a Latin Hispanic family, Latinos, and so we had a lot of boundaries around crying and expressions of grief. Anger was allowed, crying not so much. And so I know in my own personal life getting messages about it wasn't okay to cry, it wasn't okay to show deep loss and sadness, and yet the human condition, there's so much grief that we experience over a lifetime, let alone during the pandemic. And when I name them for people and I say, okay, here's my list, tell me yours. A lot of times people are shocked. I got cancer during COVID. I lost my mother. I lost both of our family pets of over 10 years. And my job changed dramatically from a full-time job to a part-time job. And so all of those things are traumatic. And I had to walk through that in some way, keep my sanity and keep going and be a person who was serving other people in their mental health. I could not do that without having the permission to grieve. And I feel like whether it's your addiction, whether it's your marriage breaking up, whether it's your kid acting out and using substances or cutting on themselves, you have grief. You are carrying grief with you all the time. And it's our job to unpack that, to look at that, to name it, to talk through it, to give it voice, and then to release it. As we pack it down and suppress it and repress it and medicate it, which is kind of the culture of these United States, all we're doing is creating a bunch of wounded adults that are walking around as, ticking time bombs just waiting to explode. And I'm not surprised when they explode in these different violent ways and these minor acts of terrorism that we've seen of late, because we're not addressing the underlying cause of their isolation, their fear, their loss, their grief, their sadness. And COVID just magnified this for everybody. So in our practice, we go into those places with you. We take you to the beginning and we walk you through to the possibility of a new day and a new tomorrow. We believe that everybody has the ability to heal. The willingness has to be there. As long as you're willing to suit up and show up, we'll walk you through that. We believe in the human being's resiliency to recover and to brave any storm. So our job is just to empower the client to become the best possible version of themselves by just believing that anything that they need and want is available to them and that it's possible for them to recover. I believe anybody can recover who's willing. Mm-hmm. So there you go.
Okay. There you go. Okay. That's all right. All right.
And that's Harmony
and
Heals.
You know,
that's me, and that's Harmony Heals. That's our philosophy, and we treat all of that. We have CBT, DBT, all the evidence-based stuff, and then the non-traditional, more Eastern philosophies as well, massage, Tai Chi, yoga, mindful meditation, acupuncture, acupressure, all of that. And we believe in holistically treating the mind, the body, and the spirit.
Wonderful. You bring up, I think, this really important point, which is culturally within our culture. How do we, as a group, as a tribe, as a community, think about mental health, and how do we address the inherent stigmas that are present in the idea that there's something either wrong with us or with our kids or with our parents or versus that we've encountered a very difficult situation, encountered something very overwhelming to us, and we've dealt with it. But the way that we've dealt with it has been not helpful for the long term.
Right.
And I think about we've had specific. I remember a client quite a long time ago who had been involved in been attacked, pulling money out of an ATM. And decided that they were no longer going to use ATMs. In fact, they were no longer going to go near banks when banks were closed. Well, that was an adaptive survival mechanism in and of itself, sure. However, it limited that person's ability as they move forward in life because they would start to restrict more and more activities that might bring them the possibility of being harmed. So sometimes our skills at survival or our skills at managing things can be adaptive in one situation, but very maladaptive in another. And so as from what I'm hearing you say, and I think it's so important that we learn to understand culturally how we view the idea of perhaps grieving or mourning or the expression of feelings or dealing with things that are overwhelming, and be able to tolerate the opportunity to perhaps learn an alternative perspective while still respecting our cultural roots.
I think some of it, I think some of it too, with that in mind around the cultural, so many other cultures are so rich and blessed in outward displays of emotion and affection as part of a normal human process. And I think we need to get back to that a little bit. And with the pandemic, with keeping the 6 feet of distance and not touching and some of that, I feel like there's going to be some awkwardness to try to come back to having human contact, which we know is vital for humans to thrive. It's a huge part of them. It's also something that helps people to stay very calm and relaxed and serene is when they get that physical touch and comforting, and we've lost some of that. But I think just being more open about allowing us to express ourselves through the emotions, not just how we look and how we dress and how we talk, but how we feel. Not being afraid to see people on your Zoom meetings maybe, and I've seen that so much this year, even professional settings, where someone will come to tears talking about some of the weight that they're carrying of grief, from losing a loved one or a job or whatnot. And we've been much more accepting about seeing that. And I think we need to really allow that to become the new norm, where when we see people crying, we don't freak out or judge or point or go, what's their problem, but just to kind of allow that and to embrace that. Go, must be having a rough day today, like we've all been having rough days, being a little bit more compassionate with each other, I think.
Yes, absolutely. The idea that and I think that's a fantastic idea to hold on to, that as we all start to come out of this pandemic, and as each of us sort of poke our heads out of the cave and make sure that everything is okay, I think that we all need to have compassion for one another as we do that. And so, for example, when you're driving and you see the person in front of you maybe not going as fast as you would like for them to go, it might be that they haven't driven in a little while, or it might be that they're still a little skittish about being outside, or they're a little worried about this or a little worried about that. Giving people the benefit of the doubt, I think, is so vital right now because as we come together as a tribe and as we come together as a community again, to support one another and to celebrate that when this is over, that we were all there for one another and we all were thinking about the other versus just thinking about ourselves. And so on that note, Gina, I just want to thank you so much for spending the afternoon with me and with our audience today. It was really such a pleasure getting to know you and getting to know about Harmony Heals. And thank you all for listening today on the Insight Treatment Hour, of course, on 98.1 FM and 1220 AM KHTS. This is Dr. Trevor Small.